Bitcoiners, welcome back to another episode of Fed Watch. This one was an absolute banger. Ansel and I, we sat down with Alex Gladstein, the Chief Strategy Officer over at the Human Rights Foundation, and we went deep. I'm talking real deep down the petrodollar rabbit hole. And I really thought that Alex brought it, but Ansel brought it with some really nuanced and detailed questions. I thought that this episode really showed the best of FedWatch and, the kind of historical and economic angle that we bring to these subjects. But overall, I think that this was an absolutely fantastic interview. And if you haven't read Alex Gladstein's piece on Bitcoin Magazine, going into the unintended side effects of the petrodollar system, you need to. It's also read by Guy Swan, so you can listen to it as well. But you got to absorb that knowledge. It's so good. Ansel, what do you think of this interview?
Yeah, we got into, I don't know what to call them, maybe systemic questions. These are not just like, of course, we asked what the petrodollar was, but we got real deep into why it's like that, what kind of consequences, maybe geopolitically, from the petrodollar in regards to world reserve currencies. So yeah, it was a very nuanced and a very systemic conversation. There, you guys did do another interview with him on Bitcoin Magazine last week, right? So there, I think he goes through more piece by piece through his article. We didn't really go piece by piece through his article. We asked these broad sweeping questions, but overall, I thought it was a really great interview. Let's just dive right into it.
Yeah, well, before we do, we need to talk about Bitcoin 2021.
Oh yeah, there we go.
It's coming in hot, y'all. Less than a month. I am getting so excited, and believe me, I am so ready for Florida. And I'm ready to meet Ansel for the first time. Been listening to this guy for a very long time, and I think the first time in maybe 4 years, I'll get to meet you in person. We'll get to see Alex Gladstein over there. He's going to be doing a keynote presentation with Jack Dorsey, so that's going to be absolutely amazing. And y'all, it's just the entire energy of Bitcoin is coming together at Bitcoin 2021 in Florida, June 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Go over the site, b.tc/conference. Go check out the speakers. Go get a ticket if you haven't already. After party is already completely sold out. Whale passes are almost sold out, and GA tickets are pretty expensive. If you're listening to this podcast, DM me. I will hook you up with a discount code. I love my fans, and I'm willing to get you guys a ticket for much cheaper than the site offers. But to anyone out there, you got to go to the website. This is the must-go-to event. It's going to be absolutely worth whatever you're dropping on it. And let me tell you, there are people who are traveling from Europe to South America, taking 7 freaking connections to stay in South America for 2 weeks, so that way that they can be in Miami for this event. So people are sacrificing to be at this event. It is truly going to be legendary, and I cannot wait. If you don't have your ticket yet, go get it. Go to b.tc, get your ticket. DM me on Twitter. I can give you a discount. And you can go and you can use MoonPay on our website in order to swipe your credit card, use Apple Pay, use Google Pay, and get the Bitcoin rate. So you don't actually have to part with any sats with our partner MoonPay, this amazing payments infrastructure provider for the Bitcoin and crypto space. You can actually use your fiat, spend your fiat, and pay us in Bitcoin, get the Bitcoin rate, use my discount code to get the cheapest ticket possible. And honestly, I'm so impressed with MoonPay just because they have made it so easy just to integrate Bitcoin and fiat. And they integrate Bitcoin and fiat in over 300 wallets. They accept fiat for over 660 countries. I think that one of the coolest features of MoonPay is that you can go from, like I said, you have a wallet that's non-custodial. You can pay with Apple Pay and with very light KYC without having to deal with any custodial risk. You get sats sent right to your non-custodial wallet. So I think that MoonPay is doing amazing work. Proud to have them sponsor Bitcoin 2021. So excited to meet their team at Bitcoin 2021. And I'm so excited to meet all of y'all at Bitcoin 2021. That is enough of me. Y'all are ready for this episode with Alex Gladstein. Let's just jump right into it. Bitcoiners, I have a real treat for you. One of the I think overall most well-rounded and impactful advocates for Bitcoin and human rights joining us on the show to talk about how sinister the dollar is. I want to introduce you guys to a man that you probably know, Alex Gladstein. Welcome to FedWatch.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Alex, you dropped this piece on Bitcoin Magazine. It's been getting a lot of attention the last 2 weeks, and Ansel and I, we needed to get you on the show to dive deeper into the petrodollar system. We've talked petrodollar, we've talked eurodollar, we've talked, everything that has to do with kind of central bank policy and the dollar in general. But again, want to dig into this with you because you just did such a deep dive into it. But before we get into it, I guess for people who don't know you, why don't you kind of give the little why are you even looking into the petrodollar and Bitcoin in the first place?
Yeah. So again, my background is in human rights. I've been working for almost 15 years at the Human Rights Foundation. We focus on helping promote civil liberties around the world in closed and closing societies, basically authoritarian countries. About 53% of the world's population lives under some kind of authoritarian regime. That's about 4.3 billion people, everywhere from Cuba to Saudi Arabia to Russia to China to North Korea. Unfortunately, there's about 95 countries where people don't have things like free expression or property rights or the right to assemble or separation of powers or any sort of real ability to check the power of their government. So HRF works to help them in different ways. And as part of that, I have spent a lot of time thinking about the financial aspect of freedom and how a lot of these authoritarian governments strip their citizens of freedoms through the money system, basically. And while I was digging there, and I will credit a bunch of people, including Nick Carter and Lynn Alden and Susan Su and some other people who wrote things over the past year that were kind of like, hey, maybe, where I started thinking, hey, maybe some of the negative externalities of the existing system are showing, right, in some of the places that I'm looking at in my work, right? And that's why I got really interested in this. And to color that more, obviously, Bitcoin critics like to focus on the negative externalities of Bitcoin, which they claim are, carbon footprint, energy consumption, the fact that it can't be regulated, et cetera, et cetera. There's a laundry list of things that they sort of say, oh, Bitcoin's bad for the world because of this. And they never stop to talk about the negative externalities of the existing system, right? It's very, very rarely spoken about, at least in that format, right? It's not something that's often said. So when I started to dig into it, what you really realize is that the current system, and in my article, I call it the petrodollar system. You could also call it the treasury bill system. I mean, what it really is the world reserve currency's current status. And it used to be gold, right? At one point, historically, we can get into that. And then it became the dollar backed by gold. And then it became merely the dollar, or more accurately, really the treasury bill. And that's kind of where we are today. And then, we're looking at the future and maybe going to a Bitcoin standard, right? So through that, I tried to analyze the current system and its human rights implications, mainly, right? And what you realize is that the current system really relies on the U.S. government propping up dictators, like especially the ones in Saudi Arabia. But to a larger extent, it helps other dictators around the world. It also has relied on the U.S. government protecting dollar primacy by force. So there's war implications. It obviously relies on propping up the fossil fuel industry as a whole. And then the other really interesting and sad part is that this whole system has been really, really good for a certain kind of person, right? So if you're like a coastal elite in the United States and you're in defense or technology or financial services, real estate, you're an asset holder in a rich country, the system has done really, really well for you. But for like blue collar workers in the United States, even really in many advanced economies, and then for folks like in emerging market economies where their government's debt is denominated in dollars and they have a hard time accumulating them, it has led to dramatic suffering around the world, right? So in short, my curiosity around Bitcoin and human rights drew me to analyze the current money structure more deeply. And sadly, the benefits that people like me get as connected elite Americans or whatever are at the expense of many, many human rights violations around the world.
Alex, it's great to meet you. I know that you've done a podcast recently with Christian, but this is my first time getting to speak with you. So welcome to the show.
Hey.
I would like to just maybe sum up the petrodollar real quick. That this was a agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to price oil in dollars. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, quite simply, a petrodollar is a dollar accumulated by an oil exporter upon the sale of oil. And the petrodollar system, quite simply, is an arrangement ironed out by then during the Nixon administration between Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, who was the national security advisor to Nixon, as well as William Simon, who was the new Treasury Secretary. And in 1974, they ironed out a deal whereby they would try to save the floundering dollar by getting the Saudi Arabian kingdom, which was then newly the kind of swing player in the oil trade. They were very important. They had acquired this new sort of powerful status where they could kind of steer OPEC. So we convinced them through a series of meetings and deals. The Crown Prince of Saudi came to Washington, D.C. in June of 74. Shortly thereafter, Nixon went to Saudi Arabia. Simon went to Jeddah. And by the end of the year, we had ironed out this deal, part of which was public, part of which was secret. The public part was that the U.S. signed military agreements with Saudi so that essentially, we would protect them and sell them weapons. Okay. And this was really obvious. If you look at the weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, they went from a couple $100 million early in the 70s when they were a normal market consumer of U.S. weapons to $5 billion by 1976. So that was not a market consumption. That was a political consumption there. And in return, they had to price their oil in dollars. And that was well known. What wasn't well known was the kind of fourth part of it, which was the other side of the Saudi promise, which was that with the petrodollars, they would buy back US debt, right? And this whole arrangement was actually, I think was classified, and it was declassified in the 1990s. There's a guy named David Spiro, who wrote a book in the 90s that really analyzed this phenomenon. And they basically got preferential deals on treasuries. Okay. So in order to save the floundering dollar, Nixon, Kissinger, Simon figured out this deal where the Saudis would only allow people to buy oil from them. And that turned into from OPEC, which controlled 80% of the world's oil reserves, in dollars. And with that income, they would then plow that money back into US debt. That was that is sort of the petrodollar system, and people call it petrodollar recycling because it's basically taking these dollars and putting them back into the U.S. And a lot of critics of the system have basically said that this has allowed the U.S. to have this exorbitant privilege of being able to run up this really, really large deficit and finance social and programs and war. Without necessarily having to devalue their currency, because we've created this artificial demand for it. Normally, if a country had a massive deficit, there would be a devaluation. People would value their currency less, and that would lead that country to do more export-led things. And then that would sort of balance out the currency. This is a natural effect that happens with countries around the world that don't print literally the reserve currency. And this is the Triffin dilemma, essentially was identified by an economist named Triffin in the 60s, was that if your country was printing the reserve currency, then there'd be this dilemma where you kind of have to keep printing and having this large deficit just in order to keep the system going. And the petrodollar like basically locked that into place. And we've been running the system ever since. And in my article, I talk about how this has been unraveling a little bit over the last decade. We you know, the apex of the petrodollar system has passed us, and now we're like, it's in its decline phase now.
Yeah, you went where I was wanting to go next. Is in today's world, do we still see the petrodollar system, playing a huge role in the international financial system? Was there some event, like I want to hone in on maybe 2008, right? The great financial crisis. Was there something that kind of marked the peak of it, and now is it less influential, or?
It's a really good question. And then this is actually the whole debate around the petrodollar, right? Because a lot of people, most people would say, they would admit, of course, that the facts are the facts and that it was clearly important in the 70s. Very few would debate that. The debate is whether, does that still have an impact today, right? And a lot of people say, no, it doesn't really matter. You know, the U.S. people just invest in U.S. Debt because it's like the best of the rest, like, and it's sort of just globally dominant.
Cleanest dirty shirt.
Yeah, or like the Churchill thing, like the best of all the worst systems, right? But and that's their argument basically, is that we shouldn't talk. We don't need to talk about the petrodollar that much. But it doesn't. It's not a satisfactory explanation. It does not explain our relationship with the Saudi government, which continues to be really intense. I mean, we continue to protect them to no end. We continue to not investigate them for their connections to 9/11. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi. Of course, bin Laden himself was Saudi, and yet we attacked 2 other countries, right? So we've been actually protecting them. So a lot of that doesn't make sense when you think about it geopolitically. Many attempts by American lawmakers in like Congress to like push back against the Saudis, investigate them for energy monopoly practice, stuff like this, hasn't gone anywhere. And even Trump and Biden both said in different ways while Biden has been president, that it would be too costly for America to pressure the Saudis. And this is why Biden, even when confronted by his own intelligence services with clear evidence that MBS ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist in Istanbul, in a barbaric fashion, he has said that we can't go after MBS personally because it would be too costly for America. So, this idea that the petrodollar doesn't matter anymore does not explain our relationship with the Saudis. But I will say that, like, I think geopolitically, we are less able to protect it than we were 20 years ago. And in my article, I talk about how American foreign policy obviously has shaped the world around our protection of the petrodollar. And I do want to make the case that at the end of the 1990s, the euro was like a very big challenger to the petrodollar system, to our ability to basically print the world reserve currency and the numeraire for energy and finance. The euro was supposed to be the answer to the petrodollar system. I mean, we defeated the Soviets, and I think any American should realize that petrodollar was a big part of that. I mean, we could print oil; they had to dig it out of the ground. This very much was a big economic advantage for us in our fight versus the communists, and I think people should understand that, and that's important. We should talk about that. But after '89. After the wall fell, we didn't do another Bretton Woods. We just were like, no, we're keeping dollar hegemony over here. So the first big challenger to that was the euro, right? I mean, the EU has a higher population. They're extremely economically dynamic. Okay, so we have the euro come in here, and this idea that the petrodollar doesn't matter anymore in modern, in the last few decades also fails this next test, in as much as, we very much protested the creation of the petro euro, right? So this idea that like you could start pricing the oil in euros and then have like other currency pairs start to become euro focused, like we did not like this very much. And the evidence is in my article painted out as such. In 2000, Saddam Hussein, right at the beginning of the euro, really, of the euro experiment, he said he wanted to price his oil in euros. And by 2002, he had. So about 5% of the world's oil was being priced in euros, sold to France and Germany, mainly through the UN Oil for Food program. And it was a big deal. And the French and Germans had a lot going on directly with Iraq, right? This is one of the reasons they opposed the war so much, obviously. And, early 2003 in March, the U.S., supported by the U.K., invaded Iraq, took out Saddam, and by June they were back to selling oil for dollars again, right? So those are facts. My interpretation of this, as I argued in the article, is that the U.S. sort of in different ways recognized a challenge to its primacy financially, which enables Americans to do what we do, have this amazing lifestyle for many of us, and have all of this military venturism and really control the world. We recognized the threat to that. And we went out to neutralize that threat. And that bought us another decade plus, okay? We were very powerful still at the time, I want to argue. Today, we're not so much anymore. So the system only goes so far. And as you pointed out, Ansel, the great financial crisis really was like a blow, okay, internationally, because other countries started to see what the US would do when met with a real crisis. And what they would do is print more dollars, right? So that concerned them. I think even the Chinese at the time mentioned the Triffin dilemma in 2008 publicly. We continued to sort of deteriorate. And then by the end of 2013, the Chinese government, I guess, had this big meeting and they decided they would no longer be like actively buying US treasuries anymore. So they started investing in like the Belt and Road, and it's kind of like their reverse Marshall Plan, right? And they're doing other things with their income rather than invest back into treasuries. So they still export to the US, they still earn dollars, but they're not recycling anymore, right? After 2014, they've been dishoarding, basically. They've been acquiring other assets and selling off some of the treasuries, right? And they've been reducing their position and increasing their positions in other things. And a lot of the world is heading in that direction too. I believe that we're still around 60% of the world's foreign reserve is held in dollars. So like meaning other, central banks still save in dollars. That's still their savings. That's still their hardest asset that they have, most desired asset, but it's dropped. So I think it used to be 80%. So over the last decade, you've seen like the beginning of the end, right? The beginning of the decline. And then you have all these other countries starting to do more business with each other. And whereas before, in the early 2000s, when America was in its unipolar moment, we could actually afford to like threaten and use force and kind of bully our way around to protect this thing. We just can't anymore. Too overextended, and other powers, have become too significant. And, this is, to me, a very clear and kind of smooth explanation. I mean, I think it's quite obvious that we were able to protect the system for a long time. It has lasted 5 decades. We're not able to protect it as much anymore. We're trying to. The Biden administration is still trying to stop Nord Stream from happening, right? They've been very clear about this. They said it's a threat to dollar primacy. I don't know if they'll be able to stop it. It looks like the Europeans really want this to go through. And that's going to start more trade in rubles and euros, right, as opposed to dollars. So you're going to see, I think my prediction is over time, the percentages of things that happen in the world are going to start to more closely track America's actual economic influence, right? So we have about, give or take, 20% of global GDP, right? Yet 40% of all debt is issued in dollars, and 60% of the exchange reserves are held in dollars, and something like 90% of all trade is priced in a dollar in one way or the other. I think those numbers are all going to come down inevitably over the next few decades, closer to what our actual economic power is. So that's kind of the macro backdrop, I think, for the petrodollar.
Excellent. You're hitting a lot of my questions. My next questions just before I even get to them. So what can the petrodollar tell us about world reserve currencies? You mentioned Triffin, and, Triffin was talking about a gold standard, or specifically Bretton Woods, and, capital account and stuff like that. What can the petrodollar teach us about what is needed for a world reserve currency? Because everybody in Bitcoin wants Bitcoin to become the world reserve currency or become a major player in that respect. So do you have any thoughts on what what you know now after studying the petrodollar? How do you think of that process differently?
Yeah, well, obviously, right. So there's a very large demand for the US dollar. And again, Triffin predicted this. I mean, if the US Treasury bill right? The dollar asset, let's call it. If there is this great demand for it, it will be different from other currencies, and there will be so much demand for it that it realistically the only way that the issuer of such a currency can keep up with the demand is by issuing more and more and more and more of it, right? By essentially running up a really large deficit that outpaces consumption, right? And that is sort of true. And he's sort of saying the dilemma is like eventually there's a devaluation. Eventually, it's not like a normal currency. Again, normally, if the deficit gets too out of whack, like there is a devaluation process, and instead of doing so much importing, you start to export more. This is like a normal balancing effect that happens geopolitically in the last 100 years. We don't have that balancing effect, so we continue to our deficit continues to look exaggerated and become even more extreme. So I mean, it is interesting though, because we get that like seigniorage, right? So we, as the U.S., like we really benefit from this in many ways. And when I say we, I mean a small percentage of us. I think that's super, super important to underline about this whole system, is that it has the benefits have accrued to a really small number of people in the United States, and by extension in the wealthy in other countries. But again, this has really helped people in finance, technology, defense, these kind of service industries, at the expense of so many others, right? So, I mean, if we think about the history, to answer your question of what have I learned, I mean, again, like the world had a gold standard, and then we moved on to the Bretton Woods standard, which the U.S. failed to uphold, right? It broke. Other nations in the 60s realized that the U.S., primarily because of our invasion of Vietnam and our war there, but also because of the great social programs that Johnson came up with, that there was no way we could hold this peg, and that to the dollar at 35 an ounce, $35 per ounce of gold. And the French and the British, threatened at the end of the 60s that they were going to come redeem their dollars for gold, and that they were questioning whether we'd have enough. And indeed, in 1971, in August, the French sent a battleship to New York City to reclaim their gold. The British asked for billions of dollars of gold to be prepared for withdrawal. And then a few days later, Nixon closed the gold window, right? So the system broke, right? So the dollar pegged to gold didn't work. So what we've learned is that the only way for the dollar really to work is to not be pegged for gold, for it to essentially keep inflating forever, right? Is this what we've seen now? So that has again led to like really large exaggerations, negative externalities that are often not spoken about. But I think as far as like where do we go from here, and what could we learn about from this system, is that maybe another system would be more fair, right? So only 4% of the world's population gets the pleasure of minting the reserve currency right now, right? And as an American, I've benefited hugely from that. But like, is there a world where it's possible that like a neutral asset that's not controlled by any one government could be the bedrock of the global kind of financial system? And how would that affect world affairs, where there wasn't like one person in charge, right? And it's kind of like a meta thought about that stems from the idea of Bitcoin more generally, which is the idea that couldn't individuals, be in charge of money instead of corporations and governments? Well, on the global stage, and I've been thinking a lot about this lately as Bitcoin is in kind of layers, right? So like clearly a lot of people start to approach Bitcoin first. They see it as once they actually understand it a little bit, they understand it could be an inflation hedge, right? Which is what you're seeing all these corporations say it is now. That's where a lot of people will stop. Fine. Okay. They see it as inflation hedge. Hard to argue against that now, given its track record, right? Okay. Then you dig into it more and you realize it's like this human rights and freedom empowerment tool, right? That it can help individuals, right? And a lot of people will stop there. That's fine. You keep digging though, and it's like, then you start to realize that it could be the new reserve currency, and it could change the world at this geopolitical stage. And then you start thinking about, well, what's that going to do to like how nations interact with each other if they're going to be settling their balance of payments with each other in Bitcoin as opposed to some currency that one of the countries gets to print, right? And I think what's so interesting is that like we're kind of stuck in this system were it not for Bitcoin. Like it's not necessarily like these other countries want the system to, like the elites of the other countries in many ways benefit from this, right? So obviously the Saudis being the most extreme example, but even like other just general countries, if the US dollar weakens, right, and the US starts to export more, that's not great for them, right? If you actually start to think about this. So we're kind of stuck. And I like to think of it like that Spider-Man meme where they're all like pointing at each other. It's like, no one really knows what to do. And we would have been, honestly, I think we might've been stuck in this for like a very long time, had there been no Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is the thing that helps us get unstuck. And it's like starting to suck value in this direction. And I think over the next decade, you're just going to see sovereign wealth funds and then central banks just start to accumulate. And at first they're going to go through this process where they're going to say, oh, it's an inflation hedge. We're going to have like a little bit of it, a little bit, just a little bit. And then over time, they're going to be like, actually, I don't really want any of this negative yielding fiat currency in my central bank coffer. I just want the real thing. That may be way down the road. But I think that's the direction we're heading. So we're all going to get to watch what happens. I mean, none of us really know. There are no experts. There are no historians that we can rely on. There's never been a Bitcoin standard before. There's never been a hard money standard that can teleport, that citizens can access just as easily as governments. This isn't like the gold standard in many ways. It is way more open than the gold standard. So I think we're going to be studying a lot of gold standard stuff to like, that's important. And we're going to be studying a lot of petrodollar stuff too. But there's not like, I mean, a lot of this is going to be building up knowledge to project. Like we simply don't have an ability to research what would the Bitcoin standard be like? Like we can make projections, but it's never happened before. And it's not accurate to compare it to the gold standard. I think there's a lot of really big differences, especially with regard to how open it is and how anybody can access the same asset as the elites, whereas that really wasn't necessarily the case during the gold standard. So I'm excited to dialogue on this with you guys, but that's kind of where I am at the moment.
Yeah, that's interesting that you brought up that it actually does benefit other countries to a degree because
meaning the current system.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Like for example, it's no longer called the third world; it's called the emerging markets, right? Because so many people have benefited over the last 50 years. Last 50 years, more people have come out of poverty than any other time. And is that due to a convergent money? Because if you force people into using the use of one money, then economic calculation becomes more efficient. You get all sorts of benefits from that. So that's kind of what I was trying to reach for was, is there, I don't know, is there something that there was actual benefit from the system that, led to the world we see today, and how will the world change maybe if we go away from a petrodollar system? Because a lot of people talk about a multipolar world, a multipolar system. And in my mind, that's less efficient, that's less peaceful, and, just worse for most people in the world.
Yeah. So we got to unpack this in a couple different areas, right? So for America, the system, as described, has been really, really good for some people, right? Amazingly good for coastal elites, the top 1%, maybe even the top 10 to 15%, like asset holders, again, people in all these service industries. Not great for the lower middle classes, actually quite bad if you look at the fact that they have like stagnating real wages. And there are effects of that are devastating to read about and think about, right? In terms of just the average middle class family and their standard of life compared to a long time ago. It's kind of crazy. Whereas the super elite have gotten a lot more elite, right? Like that's kind of what's happened here. In a lot of these rentier states, it's not been good for the average person. Okay, so you look at a country like Nigeria or Saudi Arabia, like these states that export oil at the expense of the people. Oil exporter nations, natural resource exporting nations, this whole thing's been not good for the population. They have been held back. They don't have opportunities. They don't have jobs. They have high inflation. When I say high inflation, I mean 10, 15, 20%. They are struggling, and the elite is jet setting, right? So the inequalities are most extreme in those states. When it comes to like more broadly the emerging markets, it's a mixed bag and it's complicated. But generally speaking, like this whole relationship where like now people are like dependent on the U.S. is more than just about finance. It's also about agriculture. Okay, so like it's sort of a package deal. Like the reliance on the dollar is also connected to our control of the World Bank and the IMF. They work in concert with us, right? Like they kind of this the Washington consensus is the thing. I mean, it sounds very tinfoil hat, but it's real. I mean, if you study the neoliberal right policies of the Washington consensus and the World Bank and the IMF over the last 3-4 decades, like we've wanted emerging market governments to do particular things. Like we want them to buy our grain. Okay. That's like a big deal. We don't want them to be food or energy independent. Okay. We want them to be reliant on us for food, and we want them to be reliant on buying dollars or exporting to us to earn dollars so that they can buy oil. Okay. So this is like, I wouldn't say it maps every single country perfectly, but it's, as a general trend, pretty undeniable across the emerging markets over the last 40 years. Okay. We meaning Washington, and there is no like one person pulling the strings. Obviously, this is like a whole system that has grown kind of organically around the petrodollar. Like it's not like Kissinger and Nixon knew all this would happen. I mean, they kind of got really lucky in a way. It was kind of like they got really lucky. I mean, they knew certain things would happen, but they couldn't have possibly predicted what has happened many decades later, right? But it is this kind of like organic growth, right? And it has different elements to it. But at the end of the day, it has the world being very dependent on the dollar and on US debt. And then that's sort of also tied in with US agriculture and then energy and oil, right? So if you look at the impact on the broader emerging markets, I would say it's been negative because, you know, these countries really should be independent and they should be investing into their own infrastructure, okay? And oftentimes they're not. They're like investing in paying off their debt to the US or to some other country in dollars, or they're having to figure out a way to get dollars to buy oil because they haven't been allowed to do nuclear energy to make their own, energy, right? So the US and the World Bank and the IMF have been very prohibitive and discouraging of countries from being energy independent, right? So I will, obviously in some places, like living standards are better and whatever. And obviously it's awesome that folks have like mobile phones. But like in a lot of places, they're not better. Okay. And in a lot of places they could have been much better. Okay. So, I mean, a world in which we don't have the dollar standard is hard to compare against because it doesn't exist. But I would say that it's a very mixed bag in emerging markets. It's bad in rentier states, and it's not good for most Americans. Now, I'll just talk about one other general model of country. That would be China. Okay. So in China, the government has followed an interesting pattern, right? So they joined the World Trade Organization, right? About 20 years ago, at the end of the Clinton administration. So this really enhanced and accelerated the ability of us to export jobs to China. So, in many ways, we had to keep the demand for the Treasury bill going, like the Treasury bill standard. We had to keep this thing going. And at the beginning, it was Europe buying a lot of them alongside Saudi Arabia and the petrodollar states. Then it was Japan buying our debt, right? A ton of our debt in the 80s, 90s. And then sort of shifted over to China. Okay. So for like 15 years, China was buying an enormous amount of treasuries, enormous amount. They were able to build up like a pretty remarkable manufacturing base for the world, if you look at it. And America was buying a lot of their stuff, right? Now, this was the trade-off we made, but we exported our jobs over there in exchange for kind of like the knowledge that they would be buying back back, recycling that income, into our debt. But now that's over, right? So I think you could say that, yeah, and I think Luke Gromen makes this point again and again, that like the current system is actually quite favorable to the CCP, because off the tail of that 15-year period where we were exporting them all of our jobs, and they were buying back into debt. Now that they've stopped doing that, they're like exporting and they're earning dollars, and then they're like converting that into other hard assets now, not our debt. They're converting it into infrastructure in the emerging markets, the Belt and Road. They're buying real estate. They're harvesting rare minerals, all kinds of stuff. So he's painting like a hey, when we think about, is the petrodollar good for America, right, which is the real question here. Well, it's not great for most Americans. It's a very mixed bag for the emerging markets. It's really bad for the average citizen of rentier states. And it's actually pretty good for the Chinese Communist Party, right? So that's kind of my interpretation of where we are at the moment.
To me, when I was like listening to you break it down, you're essentially just mapping out the stream of the cantillon effect, right? Of like who is closest to the money printer. And now, it started with the Saudis and now it's the CCP, and they're kind of breaking the system at the same time with the system hitting, very, very low to zero interest rates, right? And it's like, it's all kind of culminating together with Bitcoin. So I want to transition to Bitcoin. I'm sure you have something to say about what I just said, but I guess Bitcoin kind of breaks the cantillon effect. It kind of enables, it essentially enables countries like in rentier states or whatever to invest in getting more energy, right? It's almost like it's like the opposite of the petrodollar system. I kind of want to just talk about what does it mean to have Bitcoin and what does that look like?
Yeah, just to respond, it's important that we talk about the low interest rate thing. I mean, if you look at the fall of the interest on U.S. Treasuries over the last decades, so you had the run up to close to 20% inflation, interest rates rather, at the end of the 70s. And then we've just been falling ever since, right? All the way down from 20 to close to zero. And a lot of that obviously is made possible. The financing of cheap expenditures for us, for Americans, again, on our social programs, wars, all this stuff. It is easier for us to do that when our debt is inexpensive to pay back, right? So, normally we would not, I would say normally we would not have such low interest rates and such high demand for our debt, right? If we were just a normal country, right? Obviously. However, with the petrodollar system, we've been just generally able to, over the decades, have, again, this privilege of having very low interest on payments on our debt. And this has allowed us to do a lot of different things at other people's expenses, right? So I just wanted to mention that briefly, that I still think the petrodollar system matters. It still creates this kind of additional demand for the dollar. If tomorrow oil was priced in all kinds of different currencies, I think the second order effects of that would be really, really big. And there'd be breakdown in a lot of dollar denominated financial structure around the world. And in turn, because of that, there'd be a lot less demand for U.S. debt, even less than there is now. And we're already at a tipping point, right? Already, the Fed buys the majority of the new treasuries. No longer is it foreign central banks stockpiling, right? As we've discussed. So already we have this problem where we are the biggest consumer of our own debt, right? Okay. But that would get a lot worse if our dominance over different industries and stuff started to break down. So I just did wanted to hit on that piece. I think it's important to think about the second order effects of having over time these decreasing interest rates. And not only has that helped the financialization of the world and the asset holders do really well, but it has also given this lifeline to the system. Now, as far as again, Bitcoin goes, I think that the cantillon effect is real. I mean, obviously it manifests in different ways. Obviously, for the piece that I'm coming out with this week for Bitcoin Magazine, we take a look at the individual impact of the cantillon effect on people in emerging market economies and how they just get completely screwed. And I think that probably also relates on that higher level too, right? So again, if you're not minting the money and you're not close to the center of the money, and there are similar effects, right, at the European Central Bank for EU and the EU's client states, right? And they're, the EU and the dollar obviously control 80% of the world's reserve currencies, and like close to all of everything that happens in the world is if you add the euro to what the dollar does, right? So the people closest to that power do the best. I think that's quite clear. And the folks furthest away, they end up suffering. And a lot of that manifests in these like stagnating real wages and increasing asset prices, increasing healthcare prices, increasing education prices. And these things are either borne by the Americans, right? Average American is hurting right now, or they're subsidized, right? So those costs that Americans struggle with are subsidized in other countries. It doesn't mean they're not going up. It just means they're subsidized more. So the European, this is why a lot of people are very skeptical about Europe compared to America now. They're like worried about Europe's stability, right? I mean, the European nations have a different value structure in terms of what government should finance for its people. So they're doing a lot more social welfare than us in different ways, right? So I guess we'll see. But one way or the other, someone's bearing that cost, right? It's not free. It doesn't come from nowhere. And I do think that this effect is real. And if Bitcoin starts to come into play, I mean, really quite clearly to me, what happens is like individuals and families and communities and corporations and just different non-state actors can insulate themselves from these nasty effects, right? So by owning some Bitcoin, you put yourself at the same level as everybody else, right? It's like this great equalizer. So obviously, over the next several decades, if we start heading into the Bitcoin standard, governments will, they are much larger economic actors than other beasts, right? So they will accumulate a lot of Bitcoin. They will buy a lot of it, right? Or they will mine it, or they will confiscate it or to tax it or whatever. But at the end of the day, like the ability of the individual to play on their level, especially if Lightning really takes off, and to do it non-custodially, and to be like controlling and being your own bank, is going to be a game changer. I really think it's going to be very different than the gold standard in that way. Does that make sense?
It does make a lot of sense. And as you were kind of talking about Bitcoin as a leveler, it actually reminded me of a John Vallis interview. It was Vijay Boyapati and then Hugh Hendry, who is a macro commentator, and he's, generally pro fiat. But in that interview, he was kind of expressing like, hey, I am the elite. I live on this effectively sovereign little island. I have access to perfect ways to hedge around the dollar. The dollar works for me and other elites, and the plebeians, they need to be plebeians. That's just how the world works. Yeah. And like the entire time I was listening to that, I was like, you don't understand, Hugh. While you're saying that, hey, the world works fine, this is how it should be stacked up, Bitcoin breaks that. Like you have no choice, that everyone gets access to the sovereignty and the protection of Bitcoin.
Yeah, and the weird part is we live at a very weird time. Like you could call it lucky, unlucky, blessed, bizarre, call it whatever you want. Like we're living through the initial adoption phase of Bitcoin, which is, it's got to be one of those things that out of a 5,000 year span of history is one of the more unique times to be alive. I mean, really, it just happens so fast. I mean, a lot of major world events and changes were gradual. So it's not like, hey, I was alive for the agricultural revolution. Like that would have been not that exciting because you would have been alive for like a very small, tiny fraction of that. But you could probably, the three of us are literally going to witness like an absolutely seismic shift in finance, like in our lives. And what that means is that these folks who are like, even just, doing graphic design or translation services in countries like Ethiopia and receiving payment in Bitcoin, and they're like, like holding their own bank and they're custodying some sats, like they're going to be on equal footing with like powerful businessmen today who don't know about Bitcoin and avoid it partly because they're afraid of it because it disrupts the system, but maybe for a whole bunch of other reasons. But you're talking about like individuals who don't have a lot other than their own natural born talent and their ability to be creative and work and contribute to society. Like there's going to be a lot of people stacking sats, and there have been over the last 3-4 years in a very humble way, who are going to be very advantaged in 20 years. Like if they're careful about what they do and they grow their position, right? That was like definitely not possible before, right? I mean, it's not like during the gold standard, so first of all, I mean, we should talk about that. I mean, the way that the gold standard was ended was very violent, right? Or at least done with threats of violence, right? So you had both the seizure of gold at the individual level in the United States, 6102, but you also had the seizure of it internationally, right? So all the gold got sucked up into the hands of governments, right? And into these pools, right? And basically by the end of the 60s, the US had a massive amount of the gold between London and the US, between the UK and the US, like such a huge percentage of gold was like centralized, right? That's not going to happen with Bitcoin. I mean, I know that there's a lot of talk that Wall Street's going to take over Bitcoin. And I have no doubt that Wall Street's going to buy a ton of Bitcoin. I have no doubt. But the plebes, as you put them, they're not selling all their Bitcoin to Wall Street. Like, I'm sorry, they're not. Like, they're going to keep some. like a rude awakening for everybody else. And a lot of the folks, and I'm not just talking about American or European plebes, I'm talking about South American plebes, African plebes, Chinese plebes, plebes in the Middle East, plebes in India. I mean, you saw some of these numbers. There's, according to the exchanges in India, there's 6 million hodlers in India today. I mean, as of a month ago, probably more now. So we're talking like an army of like millions of people around the world who are not particularly advantaged, who are, I would say, and I mean this in a good sense of the word, like very average, meaning, not overly entitled people in different situations, in different industries all around the world today. Millions of them are like stacking. They're just like accumulating this new asset. And that is not a phenomenon we had or could have possibly had in the gold, whatever was before the gold standard, right? Like we're talking big pieces of history here, but like, let's say you were on silver as a country or wampums or glass beads or whatever. That was kind of like the best money, right? The best way to store or save. And then all of a sudden gold came. It's not like the non-elites had a chance to get an edge, right? That like didn't go down. Ditto with like, obviously over the last 50 years in the petrodollar standard, guess who's like, what's that like poker thing? Like, if you don't know who the sucker is at the table, you're the sucker. Like, who was the sucker? Like everybody who wasn't like the cantillon insider, right? So, and again, it's been partially covered up, the petrodollar inequities and the inequalities by the general, like the rising tide lifts all boats thing. Like things seem pretty good that we have like cheap technology and like all this other stuff, but there's a lot underneath the surface there that has been not so great for the average person. And the insiders have freaking killed it in the petrodollar system. I would say to a much higher extent than in the gold standard. So I think we're going to have this great reversal, and we have this unique opportunity to be alive right now where we can like spread the word, educate, and get people to start stacking in different places around the world and start like solidifying their future and their family's future, their community's future, their nation's future, before the governments and corporations figure it out. Because like they're going to be some of the last ones to figure this shit out. I can guarantee you.
I think that's a perfect transition point, right? And I love that. Dialogue, just kind of explaining how this is kind of all fallen out. But government insiders, cantillon insiders, taking a long time to figure it out. Ansel and I on this show, we've pushed kind of a bearish CBDC angle, just because like I personally I don't think they're going to ship.
But bearish on them coming like tomorrow.
Like I do not think that they're ever going to ship. And then when they do, where is Bitcoin going to be? And you're describing like, all of these plebs, all of these non-cantillon insiders right now earning Bitcoin because that's the only thing they can earn. That's the only thing that there's no other asset, right?
I mean, they can
There is
earn, like in the Ethiopian example, they can earn burr, but they don't want burr. Like, no thanks. I mean, I don't want 20% inflation, right?
Exactly. But so, I mean, yeah, I'll just hand it right back to you.
Yeah. Well, on the CBDC thing, it depends. I do think, yes. Okay. So I agree that like in the US, we may be cautious there. That's what Powell's saying. He's like, we're going to wait and see. We're going to take a wait and see approach, which as a civil liberties activist, I'm thrilled about. Like, I do not want the government implementing a CBDC. So I have a big piece coming out literally any day now, actually this week, in the Cato Journal, in this edition, about CBDCs and human rights. So we'll dig into that. But guess what? Other countries are moving forward. I mean, the CCP has already rolled out the DCEP program to many different parts of China, to hundreds of thousands of people, and soon millions. And, they're going to move forward with that, even if it's not so pretty at first. I mean, look at this whole social credit thing that is very poorly misunderstood, I think, in the media by some people. Like, it's not like this perfect thing where everybody in China has a number. That's not the case. However, what is the case is that's what the government would like to happen in the future. And people call it more Kafkaesque than Orwellian right now. Like, it kind of doesn't work super well. It's broken. It's like fragmented. There's like many different scoring systems in many different municipalities done with many different corporate partners. But the general idea is that they want you to have good opportunities in life if you're patriotic. And if you're not patriotic, and if you ever question the party, your standard of living will go down, right? So that's what they're trying to do with the social credit. Same thing's going to happen with the CBDCs. They're going to roll it out. It's not going to be super smooth at the beginning. There's going to be issues, but over time, what they do want and what they're going to drive towards is to be able to like engineer society better by having micro control over all the money, right? So, yes, I, sure. Like maybe the US is slow, but the EU looks like it's moving along. China's moving along, and then those effects will trickle down. And in the meantime, people are freaking, as you say, they're moving ahead with Bitcoin. So the fiat, like let's say the dollar system, is seeking like a life extension via CBDCs. This is like how they think they're going to survive in the future, right? They're like pegging all their hopes on like, we're going to become digital, right? Well, I hate to break it to you, but like that's not it may not work so well for several reasons. But obviously, number one, the fact that we're all being digital is better for Bitcoin, because people start to understand digital. Hey, it could be just a purely digital currency. It doesn't need to be backed by anything. I would not underestimate that impact on people's mind. Like, a lot of people still struggle with this idea of this virtual currency, right? I would say most people. So we'll see what the side effects of the CBDC push are, but I can't imagine they do anything over time but like steer more people towards Bitcoin.
So, Alex, we'd like to try to do a rapid fire question and answer here.
Okay.
This is something we haven't done before, but I loved in your article how you did put in there a small section about criticisms to the petrodollar system. And we talked about it here already today. I thought it was very fair and balanced. It's something similar like Lynn Alden does in some of her longer form pieces. She always at least mentions the other side, right? So people can get a fair and balanced thing. But I have a few kind of maybe skeptical takes that we can do a rapid fire if you're cool with that.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, so first one is in 1973 and 1974, when this was getting kicked off, right, when Nixon and Kissinger were working out this deal with Saudi for the petrodollar system, Saudi didn't like us very much. And this was really right in the heart of the Cold War. And there was a threat that it could be a petroruble instead of a petrodollar. And that might not have been so great to spread, in the containment of the communist states and stuff. That might not have been the best thing. What's your reaction to a petroruble? Petrodollar staving off a petroruble.
It's a really interesting point, and I think it supports everything we've been I've been saying here in terms of viewing the initial creation of the petrodollar inside the Cold War prism is very important to think about. Obviously, that's what was on Nixon's mind, Kissinger's mind, right? Was the Soviets. Ultimately, that was their like ultimate enemy, right? And yeah, I mean, I would imagine that as Nixon brought us off the gold standard and we're like searching for ways to prop up the dollar, and they've obviously thought about this oil piece, I am sure that they were like, well, we better do this. We can't think what it's going to do to us 20 years from now, but we certainly don't want the Soviets denominating the world's oil sales in rubles. That would be very bad for the United States, right? So, right, great point. And I would say that certainly probably was weighing on the minds of these decision makers who ended up creating the petrodollar pact.
Awesome. Okay, and we answered one of the other questions that I had about how much was the petrodollar responsible for the post-1974 boom that we had around the world in emerging markets. We covered that already, but do you have anything to add for that one?
Yeah, well, I think like the chronology is important. I mean, the petrodollar really didn't get going until 75 was really when the first wave of new OPEC money started coming in to U.S. debt purchased by petrodollars. So, I mean, it took a few years there. That's when you really started to see the security structure shift, sale of the weapons, alliances lock into place, all that stuff. So I'm not sure, one way or the other, the impact of like the petrodollar in the 70s, but certainly in emerging markets, or as they called them, third world countries, major impact in the 80s and 90s and 2000s in terms of debt crisis in the third world, because these countries, again, they had to get dollars to buy the oil. They couldn't just print their own currency to buy oil, right? So that placed this huge constraint on them where they either had to like make an export-led economy to sell stuff to the United States and get and earn dollars, or they had to buy dollars, which ends up strengthening the dollar pair for their currency and increasing the dollar's dominance. So not sure about the impact in the 70s as the system was really getting going. But certainly the petrodollar had a massive impact on the emerging world in the coming decades.
Cool. Okay, next one is gold provides a fiscal restraint or a monetary restraint to governments. So if they can't print as much money because there's a run on the bank eventually. How much did, and you mentioned it there, or you touched on it there, how much did a petrodollar enforce a fiscal restraint on other economies around the world, where it gave this exorbitant, I guess, privilege to the United States, but it actually provided fiscal restraint to other economies?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Like if you're a different country and you have like a weaker currency, all of a sudden you now really have to think about your interaction with the outside world in dollar terms. Like, again, it's not so easy just to print your own currency to do stuff. You have to like kind of gear your strategy towards accumulating dollars, which again has these effects. The critics say, well, that's so easy. You just go on the foreign exchange markets and buy them. Well, think about what that does. Let's play that out for a second. So you have 100 countries who are now all of a sudden, sure, they can print their own money, but they have two major constraints. Number one, now all of a sudden, so if these are like open markets, so you all of a sudden have 100 new countries like with an artificial like additional demand for dollars. What do you think that's going to do to the dollar? Like it's going to make it go up, right? Okay, and allow us to have lower rates, right, on our interest. Okay, so that's something that's very important to think about. And then the second thing is, that they were constrained in terms of a lot of the debt was denominated in dollars and continues to be, which is kind of crazy. Like, a lot of this debt was loaned out from Eurodollar bank accounts, or it was like denominated out of like these like World Bank or IMF type organizations to these countries. So they had to find ways to pay back their dollar debt. And that was a huge constraint on them, especially, if their currency collapsed. It made it extremely arduous for them and imposed massive austerity on their people. I mean, you had tremendous struggles and still do to this day. But I mean, a lot of these places suffered enormously in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and led to enormous devaluations of currencies around the world. Enormous.
Okay, now this question kind of take a sharp left turn here, but is my question here is in regards to populism, and we see a rise of populism around the world, especially, in the U.S. and in Europe. We see this. Perhaps we'll get a populist rise like in places like China, where they actually maybe protest their government or try to overthrow the CCP in a way. I guess I believe that the unique character of a U.S. populist movement is non-interventionist. How much does a populist movement in the United States actually affect currency, affect a Eurodollar system and a petrodollar system?
That's a good question. Well, I think some of Trump's rhetoric may end up carrying through to Biden's administration in terms of, and in a way where their hand was forced via COVID. The COVID pandemic and like the government response to the COVID pandemic laid bare the fact that a lot of our supply chains are abroad in these other countries, often inside geopolitical rivals, as a result of our policy of exporting jobs and treasuries in exchange for the stuff that we've consumed as Americans especially over the last 20 years, right? So populism, at its core, there's different kinds, but like I assume we're talking about kind of an economic populism here, where we want more jobs at home. We don't want to be importing as much stuff. We want to be growing it here. And I mean, that's been tied to the system. I mean, again, as I mentioned, agriculturally, like the whole oil shock in the 70s was preceded by a grain shock that we instigated, right? It was like there was, of course, like the Cold War kind of, and the Yom Kippur War angle to the embargo, but like there was also like part of that oil spike was like because we had spiked the price of grain, right? If you actually go back and look at it. So there's been a parallel movement by U.S. policymakers as the petrodollar has evolved to try and like subsidize and like, encourage food and stuff here and encourage other countries to be dependent on us. But at the same time, that's only been in one area. And if you look at some of these other industries, I mean, man, like we don't make a lot of stuff anymore, like a lot of it's imported. And I think a lot of what Trump was talking about, like anti-NAFTA, whatever, anti-free trade, and maybe even some of what Biden's going to do here is maybe potentially even at a subsidized rate, bring back some of this stuff into the United States, like to make it more in line with like this kind of nationalistic policy. That may be something they do. And like, ironically, they're going to want a weaker dollar for that stuff. If like you're trying to export, okay, you're going to want a weaker dollar. So it's interesting that some of the populist kind of like anti-NAFTA rhetoric may actually line up with what may happen to the dollar anyway over time as the dollar primacy declines, right?
Thanks for humor.
It may play into the hands of people who want more stuff built in the United States and want like more wages for more stuff, more activity for the middle class here.
Thanks for humoring me on that, because that was the first time we did it. I think it worked out great. Okay, Christian, what do you got?
Yeah, so Alex, again, I think this is potentially, and this is a very high honor, this could potentially be the most dense and just like information-packed episode we've ever done. And we've done a lot of very dense episodes.
You guys have great questions. I've thought a lot of new things here, so this has been great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, that's what we strive to do is kind of bring that Bitcoin and macro angle. And like, Ansel's obviously a historian and just a wealth of knowledge. So he can bring up those in-depth questions. But Alex, I want to give you an opportunity to give your last word to our audience.
Well, look, thanks for having me. Go read The Hidden Cost of the Petrodollar on Bitcoin Magazine. Spent a lot of time researching it. we didn't cover certain parts here. There's more to dig into, I think, on the American foreign policy front and on a little bit of the history of the petrodollar. But at the end of the day, when people talk about Bitcoin and its costs, just remember the current system has a lot of costs, okay? And Bitcoin was really invented to be an alternative to the existing system, where government officials can print their, if you look in the Genesis block, it's literally the creation of Bitcoin at the end of the financial crisis, and in the Genesis block, buried within this commentary about QE. We're talking about someone or some group of people that wanted to create a different system, and they have. And now we have this neutral, open, international, borderless, permissionless monetary network. And it is going to be very interesting to see how that proceeds. But there's a very real possibility of us moving entirely to a Bitcoin standard in the future. And I'm excited to see, how it goes.
Amazing. And Alex, for those living under a rock, where can people find and learn more about you?
You can follow me on Twitter at Gladstein. You can follow the Human Rights Foundation at HRF. You can look at our work at hrf.org, and you can learn more about our support for Bitcoin at hrf.org/devfund to learn about a development fund. And we are going to get back to doing our live event series later this year, the Oslo Freedom Forum. So you can look at that too at oslofreedomforum.com. So thanks so much for having me.
And today, the day that this episode is dropping, you are also dropping your next part 3 in your column. You wanna give a little bit of a preview on that?
Yeah, it's called Check Your Financial Privilege. And it is a response in many ways to the fact that the richest people in the United States and the most influential policymakers have all dismissed Bitcoin as worthless. And I'm so upset by that, because that's just not the case. And in this piece, I've gone way deep into profiling 3 Bitcoiners from Sudan, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And I've just kind of tried to paint their story and explain the economic situation in these countries and show how Bitcoin is being used by them and many others as a way out, and try to contrast this reality versus the projection of the elites in the West. And really, at the end of the day, it's time for them to check their financial privilege. So that's the idea. I hope you enjoy it.
Amazing. Yeah, I loved it. So I think everyone will enjoy it, and we'll definitely have to bring you on for a future segment as you continue to break down everything in macro, everything that's happening in geopolitics, and tie it into human rights and Bitcoin. To all the listeners, make sure to go give Alex a follow. Make sure to give me a follow at CK_snarks, and give our man Ansel a follow at Ansel Lindner. Alex, did you want to say something else? I see you kind of looking at me.
No, I'm good.
All right. Okay, amazing. And yeah, hey guys, Bitcoin Magazine, we are constantly striving to put out the best Bitcoin knowledge. So find us wherever you enjoy our content. Make sure to share us out, give us those 5-star reviews, etc. Until next time, peace.